Well, without further ado, I'll give you a formal and proper introduction. Practicing GP, broadcaster and campaigner, Dr. Anita Raja, and the founder and chief executive of Every Doctor, Dr. Julia Patterson. Thank you so much for being with us this evening. So to get started, let's kind of give an overview of what's happening at the moment. Dr. Anita, fill us in on the latest strikes and what the kind of happenings are there. Are we not on? Let's just double check. There we go. Oh, I think we have to do something with the microphones. It's like, there we go. We're green. Perfect.
So we're green now. Hooray!
Oh, perfect.
Okay,
they're doctors. Can you tell?
So the way the NHS is working at the moment, unfortunately, it is, the public sentiment is that, there are lots of waiting times, things aren't going as planned. If you are admitted in a hospital at the moment, unfortunately, you don't get the quality care that you'd expect from your healthcare professional. There's a lot of anger, there's a lot of resentment, and of course, the people who get it from the public are the frontline workers, because it's their fault that you can't see your GP, it's the nurse's fault that you're not getting your medications on time after this hip replacement that you waited for 2 long years to get. Now you're on the ward with this new prosthetic hip, you're in a lot of pain, you're waiting for your morphine, but your nurse simply doesn't have time to come around and give it to you. Whose fault is it? It is the nurse's fault. So if you look at the way the NHS is working at the moment, I think the workforce is hugely, hugely deflated. People don't enjoy what they used to enjoy. I mean, when I signed up as a clinician, I have been qualified for 13 years now. When I qualified, I remember my South Asian parents telling me to become a doctor so I could serve people and humanity. But now when I look at the way things are working, the system is simply so broken, so fractured, that we as clinicians feel immensely frustrated for our patients, and we simply cannot deliver. So on the 6th of Feb, we had one of the biggest strikes in the history of the NHS. And why did we see this? We saw this because the healthcare professionals now feel that they need to protect their patients. 500 patients are dying every week due to the shortfalls within the system. Whose fault is it? It's not the ambulance driver who's taking ages to come down. It is not the nurse's fault. It's not the doctor's fault that you're waiting in the corridors 12 hours with an MI. It's the fault of the broken system. So our nurses, of course, are demanding fair pay. At the moment, there is absolutely no incentive for people to get into the healthcare profession. We're seeing lots of medical students drop out. We're seeing nurses drop out. People are moving to better countries simply because they're underpaid. We've got a double-digit inflation at the moment, and if we compare the real term pay cut, it's around 26%. People simply cannot afford to live being a nurse or a paramedic or a junior doctor. So this is why we're seeing what we're seeing at the moment.
Thank you so much. And Dr. Julia, tell us, because I believe there has been some negotiation, there has been some advancement made in Scotland and Wales. They've managed to come to some kind of agreement. Tell us about that and why England seems to be lagging behind at the moment.
Turn this on. So just to go back to basics, because not everybody does know this, the NHS is 4 healthcare systems across the UK. So there's one in England, but there's also one in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. And they have different contracts that they work under. So workers do have different conditions in different places. Also, because of the decisions that politicians have made over the last few decades, the healthcare systems operate differently in each of the different nations. So what tends to happen at the moment is that England is the worst on almost all of the metrics that workers care about, i.e., pay and conditions, and a lot of the strain on the NHS is, if you look at the metrics, it's comparatively worse in England than it is elsewhere in the UK. Each nation has to negotiate its own contracts, and it's good to see progress in other parts of the UK, but there's a pattern emerging here where the staff in England particularly are struggling to negotiate with the government, and this isn't the first time this has happened. And so, unfortunately, the situation looks like it's going to be continuing at the moment. And I'm not working clinically at the moment, just to let you know. I run a network of doctors and represent some doctors through a campaign organisation that I run. But I just want to echo what Anita's saying. The staff are under so much pressure at the moment, and we really do need to support them through this. There's quite a lot of unhelpful rhetoric in the media about the staff endangering their patients by going on strike and for demanding better working conditions. But ultimately, we're very short-staffed now, and I would say probably the biggest thing that's affecting patients right now is we don't have a strong enough workforce. And it's because lots of people have been pushed out of their jobs into doing other things because they're just not being paid enough. And this isn't a new situation. It's been going on since 2010. And so staff have endured an awful lot. But it's like there's some kind of a tipping point now. A lot of people have kind of had enough. And I'm quite glad to see it, I have to say. Like, I think this is probably going to be a good thing for the NHS, hopefully, if they manage to secure a pay rise, because we do need to attract more staff.
And just for clarification, for those who don't know, what is it that, for example, the nurses, what exactly is it that they're asking for in terms of a pay rise, and what is it that the government is offering in return?
So basically, the nurses want a pay rise that matches the inflation rate. At the moment, we've got nurses who are actually, I know that you might find this very difficult to believe, we've got nurses who are sleeping in their cars because they simply cannot afford heating. We've got district nurses who simply cannot afford filling their cars up because the petrol is so expensive. We've got people who are unable to buy food towards the end of the month, and these are our nurses. Now, the nurses want a fair pay, and when it comes to fair pay, look, when we compare it to inflation, it's a double digit that we're looking at the moment. So they want it to be at least 17%, but the government has agreed in Wales, for instance, they've agreed a 4.5 and a 3% on top of that. And the Nurses Association, the RCN, is now saying that, yes, we'll come on the table and we'll talk about it. But unfortunately, in England, they haven't even offered anything close to that, which is the biggest problem. And it is ironic because, look, if we look at the narrative of the government, they keep telling us that if they are going to pay the healthcare workers, then the inflation will become worse. Yet, they're happy to dish out billions of pounds every year on, bank staff and locum staff, and they're happy to dish out £400,000 a month across different NHS trusts to, outsource ambulances to private companies. And Julia, you'd know more about this, and on all of this, and you've been talking about it on Twitter as well. So I'd like you to sort of just, shed some light on how much money has been dished out. So in actual fact, they can pay the nurses if they'd like to, but they really don't want to do that because I think there is a shift towards privatization, and they simply want this system to fail. One thing I would want to make clear over here is that as an NHS healthcare worker, a frontliner, working in 2023 is working in a system that hasn't failed, is being failed by our politicians. It is a system that is understaffed. It's a system that has been dried out by profiteers, which are our politicians and these private companies. There is no harm in having a private healthcare insurance if you can afford it. But there is a problem if you're trying to privatize every single sector within the NHS.
I'm glad you mentioned that. We'll come back to privatisation later. But yeah, Dr. Gio, do tell us a bit about that, because you're very vocal on this, especially when it comes to the fact that MPs themselves have received, I think you pointed out, 10 pay rises since about 2010. Meanwhile, most NHS staff have had nothing like that. Do you give us a little bit more detail there?
Yeah, I think a lot of the headlines that we're seeing in the paper at the moment about the staff pay dispute and these strikes talk about how large this figure is that the nurses and other staff are asking for. And it does look like a big pay rise if you didn't really understand the context of it. But what's happened since 2010 was that there was a long period of pay freezes, and what that's created now is a situation where there's real terms pay cuts. So compared to the amount people were taking home 12 or 13 years ago, it's a significant drop in income. I think the most significant one I've heard is the consultants within the NHS, who since 2008, 2009, they've had a 34.9% drop in their pay in real terms, which is a huge figure. And so if somebody's asking for, 12, 15, 17% pay rise, if you actually compare it to what you would have expected their pay to rise over the last 12, 13 years, it's comparatively small. And And yeah, you've pointed out the pay rises that MPs have had. I think people are feeling extremely frustrated, particularly in the middle of a cost of living crisis. There's an air of hypocrisy around the situation, or a sense that MPs perhaps are out of touch with what a lot of members of the public are going through, when people can't afford their bills, can't afford to get on the bus to work, can't afford food. It's really horrifying, actually, to hear what's going on for so many frontline workers.
No, it really is. And I think the actual problem is that people who are devising these policies are not NHS users themselves, so they probably don't know how it feels to wait on your telephone every single morning, be number 100 on the phone, and then once the receptionist does pick up, she tells you all the appointments are gone. I mean, how can they decide what's best for us? So that's, I guess, one of the biggest problems. But what we've got to understand is that, lots of people, I mean, on my Instagram, on my social media channels, contact me and say, well, you say that the nurses are striking, and you say it's not about money. It's not just about money. But it is actually just about money. No, it's not, because today, if I were to call out my plumber, on an emergency basis, the call-out charge is £170 plus VAT. These people are supposed to look after our loved ones. These people put their careers online when they're looking after our loved ones. They can simply not perform if they're worried about paying their bills, if they're worried about coming to work without food. I mean, how is this even fair? I was looking at there was a nurse who put this on Twitter, and it was quite interesting. So she is in £60,000 worth of debt because she's a nurse. And every single month, she's paying around £200 into her student, the debt that she's in. And she's accruing something around £1,300 worth of interest every year. How is that even fair? And what are we paying them, like, what, £10 an hour? I mean, I'm not kidding you. I'm from Birmingham, not even from London, and my cleaner charges me £15 cash in hand every hour. What are we giving our junior doctors? £14 an hour after £100,000 debt that they have accrued? What are we giving our nurses, £9 to £10? It's a slap on their faces, for heaven's sake. I mean, people who are talking and making them, as you've rightly said, they're saying that, they're putting people's lives at risk. I am a frontline worker, and I assure you that there have been instances where I've called the ambulance because I was worried about my patient, and 999 has told me that there is no ambulance to come and pick up the patient. This is where we stand. We are at risk every single day. Our lives are at risk. When we are sat in the back of the ambulance and we're unable to find a bed or a place to offload this patient is having an MI at the back of the ambulance. Who's taking responsibility for this? Is it the ambulance? Is it the paramedic? Is it us? Is it the A&E staff? Is it the poor GP who sent them into the hospital? Who is it? I mean, somebody needs to step up and take responsibility. And it's not your healthcare professional's fault.
Absolutely. I mean, many of us will have personal stories to attest to this, if not seeing everything that we're seeing in the news. And as you pointed out, 500 patients a week are dying unnecessarily at the moment because of long waiting times and because of this backlog. Would you say, Dr. Julia, that this government basically is just putting too much focus on the short-term costs and just not looking at the long-term huge costs of not having a working healthcare system?
It's quite hard to answer that question because, so I qualified around the same time as Anita, and I worked in the NHS until about 2018. And when the austerity cuts started at sort of the beginning of the 2010s, I thought quite naively, like, this is a necessary thing. We're having to cut back as a country. Short-term measures are having to be made, but in the long term, they'll make some of this better and they'll reinvest, etc., etc. It took me a number of years to realise that this was actually a planned decline of the NHS. And I think when you look at what's happened over the last 3 decades or so, there's been lots of changes to the NHS's infrastructure in the way that it's set up, in the way that it delivers services, and in the infiltration of private companies into the NHS. And what's happened is that the public service has been underfunded, certainly since 2010, and things have failed. Lots of staff have left, the salaries have gone down, the conditions have worsened, And it's brought down the public mood towards the NHS. Lots of people feel failed, quite rightly, because they're not able to access the healthcare they need. And it's allowed politicians to get away with doing things to the NHS that aren't going to help it. Like, as Anita's pointed out, they've done things like starved the NHS of resource, so the capacity has shrunk, and then said, oh goodness, we're not going to be able to fulfil the number of operations which are necessary. Well, let's pay this private hospital down the road an enormous sum of money to carry out the operations on our behalf. And some of these bookings that happen to private hospitals, they'll block book the capacity of a private hospital, so they'll buy up all of the capacity at enormous cost to the public, and quite often the private hospitals don't even fulfil the number of operations you might have expected, and so it's a waste of public money. But what happens in a situation like that, and there's lots of different examples, is public money is getting funneled out into these private companies to support the NHS, but the NHS itself is being starved of resource. And we've got a situation now where the NHS in England is in such a bad state that there's £9 billion in unmet basic repairs in hospitals. There's situations where patients and staff are at high risk of coming to harm. There's water leaking through ceilings and crumbling buildings. We have hundreds of buildings in the NHS that are older than the NHS itself. We need to replace lots of things, and yet the money is going to the wrong places. And of course, there's all these new conversations that are really, really important for us now, like sustainability and the energy crisis, cost of energy, etc., etc. So you've got NHS staff. I don't know what your building's like, Anita, but I hear from lots of NHS staff who work in pretty horrible old buildings that aren't very energy efficient, aren't very nice to be in, often overcrowded. And meanwhile, there's a shiny hospital down the road who we've spent millions of pounds on sort of propping up the NHS and doing a few operations. And it's the wrong way to be doing it. We should be investing in the public service so that it works properly.
I'm glad you mentioned actually those kind of buying out of private appointments and things, because actually there's been a huge focus on, on emergency situations, on A&E, on ambulances, but the backlog when it comes to elective operations is absolutely huge at the moment. Dr. Anita, tell us why that's a huge issue and why that backlog is only getting bigger.
Of course. I mean, if you look at the backlog, of course, COVID didn't help us, the pandemic didn't help us, but it's not going to be fair if we blame everything on the pandemic, because I think we were pretty far behind even before COVID hit. And yes, we're at the tail end of 2 really horrible years, but having said that, things should have been much better than they are. And at the moment, if you look at the waiting list, it's immense. I mean, it's ridiculous. I'm a GP, and the amount of patients that call in because they want me to send a letter to the hospital to please ask them to expedite that appointment because they're getting worse. I mean, if I do a clinic where I'm seeing 40 patients, at least 5 patients want me to just do this letter to the hospital, because the hospital has kindly told them that it's going to be much easier for you to get back to your GP and ask them to do us another letter requesting us to expedite your appointment. And I'm telling you, once that letter goes on that pile, they don't even read it, because none of these patients get expedited appointments.
Because what happens, because Anita's explaining her experience, I think it's really, really powerful hearing that, Anita. So just in case there's anyone here who kind of doesn't know how the system works, patients get referred normally from their GP into specialist care, and each GP is looking after several thousand people. And if you imagine that as a group of people who need healthcare, if they're not able to access specialist healthcare because there's millions of people on waiting lists and they simply can't access what they need, the people that Anita or any of her colleagues is looking after are getting sicker and sicker all the time. That's awful for patients because they might need more medication, it might be affecting their quality of life, they might develop other symptoms, they might need more painkillers, blah, 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 blah. It goes on and on. And so the burden of illness of the population you're looking after is getting worse and worse all the time. And that's awful for patients. It's also awful for the patients who might just need a quick checkup or, might just have an illness that needs a quick something or other. They're not getting an appointment. So it's affecting everybody, isn't it? And
really is.
This waiting list just isn't going down.
No.
There's been sort of pledges and things said.
So many pledges, oh my goodness.
It's crazy, isn't it?
Well, it's not going to shrink, right? Because
they don't want it to shrink. They don't want it to shrink.
They don't want it to shrink, but also how could it shrink? I mean, if you've got a shrinking workforce and you're not funding the service, well, how on earth is it going to shrink? And there's all these mad ideas as well of, we could just use more of the private sector. I was looking at the other day, how many private clinicians are there in the UK? Is there some secret army of doctors and nurses that I was not aware of? I mean, most people in the UK are trained in the NHS, right? So there are a tiny number of people who work exclusively in the private sector. I looked it up the other day. The BMA have tried to work it out. That's the British Medical Association. And they think there's 860 doctors working full-time in the private sector. That's compared to 155,000 in the NHS. And a few, there are some NHS doctors who work a little bit in the private sector, but if you're talking about, don't worry guys, the private sector will sort of swoop in and save us, all you're really saying is we'll give them loads of money and some of the NHS staff will do fewer hours in the NHS and will do a few more hours in the private hospitals. That's not helping patients, is it? It's just...
No, it's not. And we've lost, 40,000 nurses in the past 12 months alone. Yeah. We've got 35,000 vacancies for nurses in England alone. And what are we telling our next generation? Nursing is a great profession, great retention rates, the pay is amazing. Let's become a nurse. No, we're not giving them that message. I personally know 7 nurses who are living the dream life in Australia at the moment as we speak. Not because the money is great, but because there's the hours are better, the environment is better, the workforce is better, the support is better. I mean, over here, we're really drowning. We're burning out. I don't know, if you look at the BMF figures for GPs, for instance, 70% of my colleagues think that they put themselves, their license, on risk and their patients at risk when they're seeing more than 25 patients a day. On an average day, a GP sees anything between 47 to 100 patients, believe it or not. I know you think they're probably nicely tucked away having their coffee break, two hours in a day, the GP surgery is shut, but they don't stop working. They're doing home visits, admin work, they're calling patients, they're working non-stop, and they want to help you. And I'm a GP myself. We're not contracted to be doing housing letters of support. We're not contracted to be a mental health advisor. We're not contracted to do so many things that we do out of goodwill because we really, really, really want to help you. We want to facilitate you, want to be there for you. We're your family doctor. We look after you from cradle to grave, and we want to keep doing that. But they're really taking this incentive away from us. I have so many of my colleagues who are now going to Canada, New Zealand, Australia. They simply don't want to stay here anymore because the morale is so low. Because it's not just about money. I know everything comes down to the fact that, the vilification, you denigrate them. You say they're after money, they're lazy, they don't want to work, they're putting people at risk. No, they're not. We're not trained. I was trained in the UK. I mean, I did my Aussie GP here, and we were trained to look after our people, after the public, after our patients. I mean, there are days when I go home and I'm thinking about my patient and I'm like, oh my God, I need to do this. And the next morning I go and I call them up and find out how they've been. And I don't need to do that. And many of us do that. I think most of us do that. That's just because we do really genuinely want to do this job. You couldn't be in the healthcare profession if you wouldn't enjoy it. And I think they're taking that away from us now. So you're absolutely right. They're just fooling everyone by telling them that somehow, this hidden workforce will come and save the NHS. But really, it's not going to happen, guys. No one is going to come and save us. We have to save ourselves.
I think one of the suggestions, round of applause for that, I think, and to working GPs across the country. And one of the suggestions just to help with all of this, the easy workload that GPs clearly have, is a 6-day working week. That's one of the suggestions to deal with the backlog. What are your thoughts on that? Dr. Patterson, maybe we'll start with you.
Where do we start? Well, okay, so NHS staff work a lot of unpaid hours already.
Exactly.
I suppose that's probably the message here. Anita, I don't know how many hours you work. You work full time, but I don't know how many hours that is. But most of the GPs that I speak to every day, they're contracted to work a particular number of hours, but they work far beyond that because they're responsible for a population of patients, and actually you just work until the work's done. And that's true in all roles in the NHS, really, because you're responsible for the safety of your patients. I've heard, you were touching on morale just then, Anita, and I just want to kind of echo what you're saying there. It's difficult, really difficult for staff to talk about this themselves. Some of the people in our network have been writing opinion pieces anonymously for the papers recently. They haven't wanted to put their names to things because it's very, very difficult to reveal how much this situation is impacting on people and their families, and their personal lives, their mental health. And I think I can probably say this with freedom now because I don't work clinically anymore. But it's very, very difficult to admit that you're struggling. We are a workforce of people who've been taught to be resilient in very difficult situations. That's just the training that you have. And any admission that you're struggling it's not so much that it's looked down on, but everyone's under a lot of pressure. Yeah. And so it's quite difficult to admit that you're having a difficult time. My background is as a psychiatry doctor, and I'm quite close to a lot of doctors who I talk to online, and they've been talking to me over the last 3 years, 4 years or whatever, so I kind of get updates about how things are going. I've had a few emails recently of doctors who I know quite well who are suicidal, and the ones who have spoken to me are doing it because they feel a bit better now. They're kind of in recovery, they've had some support, and they want things to change, and that's the reason they've come to me, and we're talking about it. But I'm desperately concerned. There's a real problem with not just suicides and suicidality, but people with anxiety and depression, OCD, post-traumatic stress disorder after the pandemic. And none of this is really focused on because it's like everyone's running at 100% all the time. Go, 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 adrenaline. I hear about a lot of doctors who take a bit of annual leave, and it's when they take the leave that they crash, actually, because they allow themselves to stop. So I've probably gone off at a bit of a tangent here, but I think sometimes what we see in the papers is the headlines of how everything's urgent, and staff, particularly during those times when there's a focus on crisis, like winter crisis, what we've seen over the last 6 weeks or so, staff will go up to the microphone and will be talking, and they talk in a very strong way, don't they? There's a lot of talk about we're going to keep patients safe, we're going to do everything we can, people go above and beyond. But what gets missed, I think, sometimes is that all of that takes a toll on the staff. And we're talking about pay. Pay is important, but quite honestly, like I run a network of doctors, and over the last 3 years, we considered twice running a campaign about NHS staff pay. And the doctors that I represent twice said, I don't want you to run that campaign. I don't want the team to run that campaign. Pay isn't the thing I want. It's better conditions, it's feeling like I have enough staff in my team, it's feeling like I can have a coffee break. I mean, I wasn't able to campaign for those things very effectively. We try and talk about, so pay is really important. I don't want to sound unsupportive of anyone campaigning for pay. I think it's really important, but it's one of the things.
Yeah, exactly. It's one of the things. And you asked me that question about the hours. So let's put things into perspective. When I read the papers, I find it quite astonishing, actually quite amusing, when there are lots of nasty comments about all these GPs who are part-timers working 3 days a week, lazy, don't want to do their work. Let me tell you how many hours a part-time GP works. If you're working 3 days a week, which is a 6 session, you're actually doing 40 hours a week, which would be equivalent to anybody else doing full-time work. So if a GP is doing 4 days a week, they're probably doing 60 hours. And if a GP is doing 5 days a week, they're doing more than 100 hours. I know GPs who get into the building 8 o'clock in the morning and do not leave before 9 o'clock. So it is a very, very stressful job. And the worry that I have for my healthcare profession, my healthcare colleagues here, is that we're burning out, we're probably making the wrong decisions, we're missing things, and we really are putting ourselves and our patients at risk. But if we don't do that, then who's going to do it? So it's a very difficult one. And yes, as you've said, I don't want to say that it's not about money. Yes, money is important, and it's one of the things. And I'm sure that if you're happy to pay your plumber 170 plus VAT, it's okay for your nurses to just get paid a bit more. I mean, enough for them to be able to afford a mortgage and for them to afford food. But to put things into perspective, I just wanted to tell you that if a GP is working part-time, 3 days a week, even then they're working 40 hour a week. So that's a lot.
Not to mention filling in outside of that time at home, working from home, all the stuff, as you say, that they don't have contracted hours to work for. I did just want to shout out the organisation you founded there, Julia Every Doctor. So you support doctors across the country. Do give us a little overview of that, just so people are aware of it in case they're not.
Yeah, So we're a group of doctors, but not just doctors now. We actually have a lot of members of the public who we call supporter members. We talk to about 450,000 people every day online about the NHS. And we started as a team of doctors because we were worried, this was kind of 2018, 2019, about how working conditions were deteriorating, and that made things worse for the staff and the patients. And so we set up a campaigning organisation, it's a non-profit. And then the pandemic hit, and well, it was just a horrendous time for an awful lot of people, and I suppose our profile grew, and then we took the government to court along with Good Law Project about the PPE deals that they were doing. So we proved the VIP PPE lane that you might have heard of. And now, yeah, we have this incredible community online of people who are very concerned about lots of issues relating to staff welfare, patient welfare, and the state of the NHS, the future of the NHS. And what's really interesting about what we do is we had started it imagining that we were just going to be advocating for doctors. And there's a lot of messaging in the papers that sort of tries to split patients versus staff.
Oh, yes.
But, I mean, I spend all my days talking to people online. That those divisions don't exist. The staff want the same thing as the patients. Everyone wants a safe, excellent service. And the only way we're going to create change is if we come together and kind of push for that, because we shouldn't be pitted against each other. It's absolute nonsense, you know.
100%. And we need to change that narrative. And I say that whenever I get the opportunity to say this, because... You know, I say this. I'm not saying that we're fantastic. We have our flaws, of course. You know, but one thing I know is that we're trained. It's drilled into us. It's ingrained in us that we must look after our patients. And trust me, when we're not giving you our 100%, we find it hard. I mean, it affects our personal life, our family lives. It affects our mental health. And you know, I was pregnant throughout I had a high-risk pregnancy, and you know, what else would you need? You know, when you have a high-risk pregnancy, you would need the pandemic to make it better for you. So I was a GP, and I remember there was we didn't know what to do. One day I walk into work, and all the appointments are changed from face-to-face to telephone, and I'm like, oh my God, what's happened? And I remember I was 20 weeks pregnant with my son, who was a high-risk pregnancy, and they said, oh, you know, they were saying the CCGs have said that CCGs actually are they work towards funding of GP practices, have said that, you know, we need to do telephone triages now because, you know, the pandemic has hit us hard. And I remember the fear, because we didn't have PPE, we were still doing home visits, we were still going out, seeing people at home without PPE, and we were still working, and we lost so many of our colleagues during the pandemic. And now it all started from clapping for us, and now it's towards sacking us. So, you know, it's just it's a complete joke, isn't it? The way things are. It's ironic. I mean, sometimes I find it amusing, and you know, sometimes when I pick up the papers, I wonder, you know, these people who are commenting about how the healthcare system should work, how they've devised this task force which is going to help the NHS survive, and, you know, they've somehow created these 5,000 extra beds, and, you know, they've somehow got these 800 new ambulances, while the workforce is actually, you know, in industrial action. We don't have anybody to drive these ambulances, or maybe we do have the private companies, I don't know. But it's just so ironic. I mean, I mean our leaders have absolutely no clue how our people are suffering every single day.
Absolutely. So I think maybe let's come on to, I suppose, some of the suggestions that, you know, have been brought to the table. Obviously, as you say, it's a huge push toward privatization. One of the suggestions that's come out of Scotland recently as a suggestion is that higher earners should pay when it comes to A&E visits, should pay for doctor's appointment, etc. Give us your thoughts on that particular kind of policy, Doctor.
I personally think that I was born and bred in Germany. So I work here as an EU doctor. And I think that one thing we have established, I think Julia would agree, is that the government simply does not want the NHS to work the way it is working. And now that we have established that the government doesn't want to fund it, because they don't have money to pay the nurses, but they have money for bank staff, they don't have money to get new beds within the NHS, but they have money to build this new hospital next door, which is a private hospital. So we've established the government doesn't want to do anything. Then what do? I personally think that it might be worth looking into the system which Germany follows. So Germany has a system where it's a mix of, the private sector along with the government sector, but what it essentially is based on is your pay. If you're making more than 67,000 euros a year, then you are supposed to pay towards this health fund, which you split with your employer. So maybe it's a good idea. I might be completely wrong, but this is just an idea that comes to my mind when I'm thinking of how we can fund the NHS, where if there is a multinational company, for instance, somebody's working for Sainsbury's, then the employer is actually contributing towards their health fund. This health fund is not a private insurance, it's just an independent health fund. And that goes towards costs of, seeing your secondary care consultant, because it's ridiculous for you to be hobbling around with an osteoporotic hip for 2 years waiting to see your consultant, or for you to have an epileptic seizure and wait 18 months for someone to see you and tell you why you've had that seizure. It's completely ridiculous. When I sit down with my family that live in Germany and I tell them, these are our waiting times, they're shocked because they get their new hip within 3 weeks. So there's a huge difference in the way we're operating, unfortunately, at the moment. So that might be an idea. So if you're earning above a certain threshold, there's a health fund, and that goes towards paying your costs in the NHS. And multinational companies should actually be paying 50% towards their employers, like people on minimum wage working for them. There should be a fund for each one working, and then your employer sort of pays towards it. This is just something that I think might work.
Great employer contributions. Obviously, definitely something to think about. Dr. Julia, what are your thoughts on this?
I think, unfortunately, a lot of people are probably starting to think in the way that you do, Anita, because things are so bad. So people are trying to think of solutions and trying to think about what's fair. I've been thinking about this a lot recently because I've actually just written a book about it. And
in June, I believe.
Yeah, it is. And at the end of the book, I had to propose some solutions, which was actually really, really difficult because it can be quite easy to criticise, and it can be much more difficult to sit down and think, all right, well, how on earth would they unpick this situation? It's in such a mess. It would cost so much money to reverse the things that have happened. Because over the last 3 decades or so, it's not just a case of the NHS becoming overwhelmed because they haven't given enough money for 10 years and we don't have enough staff now. What's happened is the system used to all be linked up and it all used to be publicly owned. And now what has happened, because of different reforms governments have put in place, is that some bits of the NHS that say NHS logo outside are actually private companies running services. Some bits of the NHS are actually being bought up by private companies. For example, there's a couple of American insurance healthcare companies that are buying up GP surgeries. So the NHS itself has become very fragmented, and not all of it is a public service anymore, in the sense that it's not, owned and run by the public service. So when we think about how to fix it all, it's a very disparate situation, be very difficult to do. And there was also a situation about 20 years ago, you might know all this already, but a lot of hospitals and other healthcare facilities were built with PFI money, which meant that private companies put up the money for hospitals to be built, and the NHS then leased the hospitals back off the private companies. And we're in a situation now where we pay a couple of £1 billion a year just in debt to these companies who were leasing hospitals off. In some of these hospitals, the bill for the debt is twice the amount that we pay on medicines for those NHS trusts. It is an enormous amount of money. So it's very, very complicated. And when I was sitting down thinking about all this and thinking about what needs to be done, could it be done, I went back to the NHS Constitution, which is on the government's own website, which stipulates what this public service is meant to provide. And it's meant to provide a free, comprehensive service for everybody. And it's not doing that now. You can't look at what the NHS is currently doing and think that this is a comprehensive service, because it's simply not. When you've got a situation where 500 people are dying needlessly every week because they cannot access urgent care. So the government are failing on the, is it a comprehensive service? No, it is not. They're also now suggesting that they want to remove its free, the fact that it's free. There's been suggestions from senior politicians that they want to start charging in various ways. And my feeling about it is that the public have never had a referendum on any of this. There's no mandate that the government holds for doing any of the things they're doing in terms of fragmenting the NHS or indeed involving privatisation. And when I talk to the public online, and when I look at the polls that are coming out all the time from all of the big opinion polls, the public believe in the principles of the NHS, and the public want the NHS to continue. So there's a divergence in what the government are doing and what the public wants. So my feeling about it is the government's got two options. Either they do the really big things, they put a huge amount of money into paying off PFI debt, renationalising the service and stopping outsourcing, and they do that of their own volition, which I don't think they're going to do, or they take it to a public referendum and the public decides. But either way, it can't continue how it is, because if you look at the trajectory of changes, the service is now collapsing all around us, and it's going to get worse, and none of the solutions that they're putting in place are going to work. They're not going to work for the public. It's going to get more expensive. Some people are making a profit. And meanwhile, there's a two-tier healthcare system evolving in the country. I'm sure you guys, like, I've been walking around London today, I've seen private healthcare ads, I've seen things flashing up saying, you know, you can't access your NHS GP, click this app, get a blah, blah, blah. Nobody should be having to do that. We have a public healthcare service and it's paid for by taxes. So the idea that people should have to pay doesn't make sense. And just, sorry, Anita, I don't want to, like, I do disagree with your idea about healthcare insurance system.
That's what we love, it's trouble. You can disagree.
I disagree with it because, you know, looking back at metrics of the NHS for how it was performing even a few years ago, in 2014 and 2017, the NHS was judged to be the most efficient, best healthcare system in the world by the Commonwealth Fund, which looks at lots of similar countries to the UK in terms of economics. It's only in the last 5 years or so, even though they've been underfunding it since 2010, it held on to that top spot. It's only in the last 5 years or so that we have started dipping, and now we're number 4, and I'm sure that it's now going to go off a cliff, you know, in terms of how we perform compared to other countries. But there's an argument, there's a pervasive argument that gets shared online, I get told it all the time by people online, that the NHS is inefficient, it doesn't work, and it's a bottomless pit, and blah, 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 blah. It's just not true. We used to have the most efficient healthcare system in the world, so we can go back to that. And we don't need a healthcare insurance system or any other system that's going to generate profit for private companies. And anyone who's unsure about any of that could maybe look at other decisions the government are making at the moment. They have a clear agenda to help private interests, and it often comes at the expense of the public, unfortunately.
Thank you so much. Absolutely. I mean, lots of different options there, which is really interesting. So hopefully maybe a new election a change of government might help things out somewhat. Have you seen anything suggested by the Labour government or any of the other parties that we supposedly have in this country? Any suggestions that you think would be worth pursuing when it comes to healthcare, Dr. Anita?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I just feel that, you know, when it's just, I think we're not winning here at all in this situation. Because you know, when you pick up the papers, it's all about, you know, I'm a GP myself, so it's about, you know, buy these GP surgeries off. All of them should be salaried. All of them should do a 9-to-5 job. They, you know, they're running businesses and they're making huge amounts of profits, and they're, you know, they're greedy and they're not working hard enough. No, we're not working hard enough. Oh my God, we're giving you 110%. We'd be in our graves if we would work more than that. But yes, you know, so I simply don't see a solution to this, if I'm honest. I personally have nothing against private companies. You know, they can work, and if somebody wants to go to and can afford it easily and happily and wants to go, well and good. You know, it takes the pressure of the NHS. If you're wealthy and you can go privately, go to a private company.
Well, there's always been private healthcare.
Yeah, exactly.
There's always been private healthcare, but there was also
harm.
a functioning public system.
That's the thing. So, but it should not be mandatory.
It should be a choice.
It should be a choice. Yeah, you shouldn't be forced to scoop out a huge amount from your pension just because, you know, you have to wait 2 years to see a consultant, whilst you can't actually afford doing that. It shouldn't be mandatory. It should be something by choice, and if you've got the money, go for it. But it shouldn't be a burden. And I seriously don't see right at the end of this tunnel. I certainly don't.
Okay, well, I think we'll come to questions from the audience in just a second. It sounds like they're having quite a party upstairs, so if anyone can't hear, do just let us know and we'll see if we can get them to turn it down. But I suppose my final question would be, if you were talking to someone and they said, you know, they don't want to contact their GP, they don't want to call an ambulance, they're sitting on a health condition or a medical condition, and they're not going to seek treatment because of the fact they don't want to add to the backlog, they don't want to add to the pressures, they don't think it's important enough, and they're putting up with pain, they're putting up with discomfort. What would you tell them? What would you advise to them? Dr. Julia, maybe you tell us first.
Well, I would feel terrible for them, and I think there are a lot of people in a situation like that. I hear from people on Twitter quite regularly who are explaining what's going on for themselves and their loved ones. It's horrifying. And some of those people, it's happening in urgent situations as well. It's like, you know, you call an ambulance, the ambulance doesn't turn up, and awful situations. People, there are real problems in the NHS, and I don't want to pretend that's not happening. And I can understand why some patients might feel that they don't want to approach the medical services, and awfully, like Anita, you probably see this all the time. It's often these humble, kind people. They don't want to bother anybody, you know.
And they're awfully sorry that they've even called you, and I'll be like, please don't be sorry.
But yeah,
this is my job.
People need to still, you know, try to access the care that you need. But the other bit of it, I guess, I would say is, please. Also, once you have accessed and received the care that you needed, can you please tell your MP what is going on? Because politicians are only going to change things if they're put under sufficient pressure from constituents who, to be quite frank, say quite stark things like, I will not vote for you unless, you know, because I think, just coming back to what you were saying just then about the other political parties at a next general election, I've got huge concerns, quite frankly, because, well, the Green Party are anti-NHS privatisation. We've been running a campaign for about 2 years now, and at one point I was, along with a team, trying to set up what's called an all-party parliamentary group against NHS privatisation, and that involved picking up the phone to an awful lot of people and trying to convince them that they would like to form an all-party parliamentary group, and we were going to kind of do the administrative stuff on their behalf, but it's run by politicians. We couldn't find a single Conservative politician in either the House of Commons or the House of Lords who would be a part of this. There are some Labour politicians who are strongly against NHS privatisation and do fantastic lobbying work, and the same in the Green Party and some of the other smaller parties as well. But the current Labour leader, Keir Starmer, the proposals that he's putting out for the NHS are really, really concerning, quite frankly. They're not supportive enough of the current workforce. And also, they look like they're going to be trying to do more of this funneling money into private companies and hoping that private hospitals, for example, are going to prop up the NHS. And when you really dig into it, there's sort of donations being made to the Labour Party from people who used to donate to the Conservative Party. And, you know, you can sometimes join dots where dots don't exist, right? So I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but it does seem a bit like they're not going to do enough, I don't think. Let's put it that way.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Anita. Your thoughts?
I certainly think that if you need to, please don't worry about burdening the NHS. It's already under a lot of burden. I always tell my patients this. I'm like, seeing an extra patient is not going to kill me. I do want to see you if you're unwell.
But it might kill you if I don't see you. So.
Exactly. So, and I'm ever so blessed. You know, I work in 2 different surgeries, and I love these places, and I've been working with them since I qualified as a GP, and I simply love what I do. Sometimes I get a bit burnt out because I don't see my kids enough, but I'm ever so grateful that, you know, my parents forced me into becoming a doctor, by the way. I wanted to become an actress. And I remember that my dad said to me, he said, when I was 18, he said, look, woman, either you get married to someone I choose for you, or you do medicine. What are you going to do? And I was like, I'll do medicine, Dad. That's what I'm going to choose, because I'm going to marry someone I want to marry. And that's what I did in the end. So, you know, but I was so glad that they pushed me to become a doctor, because I do quite enjoy it, and general practice is amazing. You know, it just intrigues me. I'm always so interested in their lives, and I want to know what's happening because I'm so nosy. So, you know, I would say, look, don't worry about us. I think it's very important to dial 999 if you think you need to dial 999. Yeah. Dial 111 if you think you need to dial 111. Call your GP if there's not an appointment. Don't tell your GP I gave you this tip, please, guys. Walk into the reception and speak to the receptionist face to face. She will give you an appointment. So if you're not getting any luck on that phone call, just walk in. It really does work. 99% times it will work for you.
Oh my
See
goodness.
us. We want to see you.
That's the best tip we've taken there. Actually go to your GP. Force them. Say you'll sit in the waiting room until you're seen. Oh my goodness. Thank you so much. Well, I'm sure lots of you have your own thoughts on the matter and have your own comments and things like that. So we're going to come to questions now. We do have a microphone, I think. If someone's... Yeah, we do. I know it's very scary going first, but if anyone has a question, absolutely, let's go for it over at the back. I'm very blind, so if I don't see you, do just wave at me. I also have an eye infection, which I'm going to get a prescription for later on. Thank you very much, both of you, for being here. Yes, go for it.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm really interested in when you both touched on the public will or the public perception and the public view. Because obviously you both talked a lot about newspaper headlines. I mean, I certainly feel for most people I know, newspaper headlines don't represent my views, neither do Twitter comments. And I mean, I definitely want to emphasise no one I know holds any of those views that you've quoted, and it made me realise how much I actively avoid all of those sources, so I'm not even really aware of how awful the criticisms have been. But it made me wonder when, for example, you were saying the public appetite is in support of maintaining the NHS, but on the other hand, we have these headlines. And I wondered at all if there's any further commentary or division you're aware of. For example, is there a generational divide? And one of the things that makes me think about this is, so I work in the legal area, and we have some of the same trends, but none of the same level of crisis, although I'm not in crime, so someone else can speak to that better. But for example, we had a meeting about effectively burnout about 6 months ago, and someone very senior said, well, the reason why you would put up with this at the junior end is because, like in the medical system, you want to become a consultant. And all of the juniors who I work with came down on him like a pile of bricks, and it was the most disastrous thing he'd ever said, because everyone junior in my work that has no connection to medicine, we don't deal with medical negligence or anything like that, we all knew, some of us through direct connections, otherwise just through being aware of the world, that, I mean, we said suicide in our responses directly. We said this is the state of junior doctors right now. The suggestion that that would be a position we'd want to put ourselves in is ludicrous, and that has really hurt your case. So we deal with arguing, so it was a bad route for him to go down. And so to me, that is already where we are and where we have been. But of course, we all exist in our own social media bubbles now about where we get news, etc. I don't know how representative that is. And I wondered if you could comment on, particularly with campaigning, etc., what your view is about genuinely how representative it is. And for example, if we went down the referendum route, we know how that's panned out in the past.
Oh, yeah, the Brexit, I know. When you said that, I was like, ooh, do we really want to go down that route?
Privatization, here we come.
Do you want me to answer, or do you want Anita to answer?
Either.
I want you to answer this question.
Oh, right, okay. It's a really interesting question. I'm going to answer the bit of it that's about what do people think, in terms of the newspaper headline stuff. So first of all, Anita, I don't know what your response has been when you have seen those newspaper headlines, particularly about face-to-face GPs and just awful stuff. And there was some stuff in the Daily Mail about 18 months ago that was talking about using hit squads against GPs. They ran a campaign called something like Let's See Our GPs face-to-face, and it ramped up for a few months. And the rhetoric within it was very much GPs are, sort of not seeing enough patients face-to-face, and it was blaming the GPs about this. What actually happened, as Anita talked about earlier, was right at the beginning of the pandemic, a letter went out to all of the GP surgeries in England telling people that they were going to move to mostly telephone consultations instead of face-to-face consultations. And I was talking to lots of GPs online at the time. There was an awful lot of worry about that, because clearly some things you need to see patients face-to-face. Yes. And so, to my knowledge, from all the GPs I know, I didn't know a single GP who went wholly face-to-face, wholly telephone consult.
That never happened.
All the way through, because, when it was necessary, patients were brought in and were seen face-to-face. But what happened as the pandemic, sort of the major waves subsided, what I think has happened is we noticed the crisis, the really bad crisis, it was affecting primary care first. So people in the communities were struggling because these waiting lists were building, and the GPs felt the pressure before the hospitals and the A&E departments and the ambulances felt the pressure. And what happened in the media, and the government could see these waiting lists ticking up, and their response to it was a really concerted, seemingly, campaign against GPs, blaming the GPs for what was going on. And it got so bad that I was receiving messages from GPs in our network who were, in tears, developing mental health problems, going off work with stress, going off work with suicidal ideation because of this ramping up of this campaign. abuse towards staff increased. So some of those newspaper headlines, even if they're only being read by a proportion of the public, are having a real marked impact. And there are GPs in my network who patients were kicking indoors,
Yes.
who all of the reception staff quit because they couldn't deal with the amount of abuse. There was a case near Manchester where a GP was attacked with a metal pole, and he had a fractured skull. It was awful. I mean, there was a time where we were writing these rebuttals to some of these articles which were being ignored by newspapers, but I was genuinely worried that a patient was going to kill a GP. It was so bad. So there is a section of our population who are reading those things and who are susceptible to that type of rhetoric, and for whom it's very powerful, and that's very, very concerning. In terms of what does the broader group of people in the public think about things, I keep quite a close eye on some of the big polling websites which kind of track the big issues in the UK and what people are most worried about at any one time. The NHS is normally in the top 5. It's actually normally in the top 3. And then they dig in more detail in things like, how do you feel about a privatised NHS? How do you feel about the future of the NHS? How do you feel, are you satisfied by the NHS? And what has happened in the last year or so is that the satisfaction with the service has plummeted. And some of the newspapers have taken that opportunity to write lots of articles saying things like, the public has fallen out of love with the NHS. And when you actually look at what they're referring to, it's the fact that the satisfaction with the service has obviously plummeted because they can't see anyone and they wait on the waiting list or whatever. And the feeling I get, and I talk to a lot of people online from both sides, I get the Twitter, you're all dreadful and blah-de-blah and no one's seeing any patients and I hate you all. And I get the NHS is my favourite thing ever and blah, blah, blah. So, you know, you have to kind of, there are extremes and we try to ignore the extremes and listen to the main body. From what I can tell you, and this is all I do every day, the vast majority of people want a public service to continue and recognise the value of having that. And I think, just to say one last thing, a lot of people are particularly concerned because the way the healthcare is going in our country, it's going to be more like the US. And I think people are quite aware of how bad the US healthcare system is and how it's a system which only caters for people who can afford it, really. There's a lot of people who lose out. And so my feeling is if they ran that referendum, if they said to people, do you want us to scrap the NHS because it's a bottomless pit and blah, 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 I still think people on the whole would say no, we want the NHS to continue. Which is why there's never been a referendum, and I doubt there will be one either.
We hope not, definitely not. Do you want to comment on anything, Dr.
Yeah, and
Anita?
I just wanted to talk about these GP appointments as well. So we are seeing 1.3 million patients a day. 1.3 million patients a day. 2/3 of these appointments are face-to-face and 1/3 are telephone. And let me assure you that 1/3 do actually just need a telephone. I, for instance, not that I have spoken to my GP in the past 5 years, but if I were to need a GP appointment, I'm pretty certain I'd like a telephone rather than having to take time off work and then sitting to see my GP. I'd like to speak to my GP over the telephone. So we've got loads of people who still would prefer a telephone appointment, for instance, for sick notes or a prescription request or, you know, a discussion of a letter. But all patients still have that option to come and see their patients, especially people from the elderly group would rather come and see their GP, which is an option is always given to the patients. And it's very demotivating. It's quite interesting because I work in Birmingham and these are 2 different surgeries. So one of them is in an area which is predominantly South Asian. And when I'm working in that area, believe it or not, the consultation is in Urdu or Hindi. I forget that I'm in the United Kingdom. I sort of think it's a cultural shock. Like they'll walk in and they'll start speaking in Urdu or Hindi. They'll assume, looking at me, that I know the language without even asking me if I know the language. And we're 5 GPs that work in that practice, and all 5 of us are either Indian or Pakistani or Bengali, but we can speak Urdu. So when you go to that part of Birmingham, there's a lot of dissatisfaction. I think, when it comes to satisfaction, the NHS, the way the system works now, unfortunately, there's a huge language barrier as well. So if you are, if you were to work in an area where we've got people who don't understand the language, then they have very little faith within the healthcare system, and the clinician also. There's so many barriers: language barrier, culture barrier, religious values, loads of things. And of course, they've got more faith in what they're being told by their relatives, for instance. They're going to take a relative's advice and they'll probably have more garlic than start the statin that we're prescribing them, because the garlic will help their cholesterol come down and works wonders.
Do you think there's a generational difference? And it's just like, you know, between young people and older people, is there a difference in what people are saying to you?
I think it's more to do with when they came to the country. For instance, even if it's the younger generation, if they've moved to the country, say, 2 years ago and they don't speak English, they still have faith in what somebody back home in their village is telling them about their blood levels, rather than someone from here is telling them. And there's a lot of dissatisfaction, I feel, when I'm working there. I mean, there are a lot of people who come in and they're not happy with the service they get. There's a lot of ranting because they're not getting what they need. Whereas I'm working in this other part of Birmingham, so there's other surgeries in this other part of Birmingham, and I feel that every patient comes in and is so grateful. So it's quite insightful. So I guess, you know, when it comes to your opinion is based on, I guess, your cultural beliefs, your values, where you're from, what you have received from your healthcare professional. I mean, has your healthcare professional listened to you? Has the healthcare professional tended to your needs? I mean, has the healthcare professional understood you? It's very easy to just tell them not to believe that garlic is going to work. But you know, I guess it's all about where you're from. It's a lot to do with, I think, cultural beliefs as well.
Awesome. Wow, a really important question. Thank you so much. Yeah, we'll come to the front. Hang on, let us just get you the microphone very quickly. Hold on a second. Otherwise, no one at home will have any idea what you're saying. Go for it.
So, actually, back onto potentially the elderly patients. I remember when the austerity measures came in, it was the NHS was ring-fenced regarding funding, and that funding was frozen, but the social care portion of the funding was reduced as part of austerity. How much of that decrease in quality of work in the NHS has been because of the NHS taking on more of that social care, in particular, so potentially the elderly care and the other type of care in the community?
Good question. Talk about it, or do you want me to talk?
You can talk about it.
Okay, so the government and other people as well are talking about, during the austerity years, about how the NHS was kind of safeguarded from that. When you actually look at the decade 2010 to 2020, the amount of real terms increase in investment was very, very low. Now, just to explain, healthcare gets more expensive every single year. You actually need to increase the amount of funding you put into any public healthcare system every single year to maintain the same system. And historically, the amount that has increased has been about 4% on average in the decades preceding the 2010s. But what happened during the 2010s is that the real terms decreased to 1.6% over the decade. So I think there was a period right at the beginning of the decade where they did sort of safeguard it, but they've made out that there was a lot more safeguarding than there was. Actually, there was a lot of squeezing of the funding during that decade, and so the NHS had significant cuts during that time. But in terms of the social care, you're absolutely right. We're in a situation now where there isn't enough capacity of social care in the community. A lot of it comes down to the staff workforce in the community, because social carers simply aren't paid enough. It's a really difficult job, and we're not looking after the staff properly, and so we don't have enough carers. And we're in a situation now where some NHS hospitals in England, a couple of months ago, I don't know what the situation is like right now, but a couple of months ago, there are a few hospitals where 1 in 3 hospital beds was taken up by somebody who could have been discharged home, was ready to go, but there was nowhere, they couldn't go home because there was no care for them once they left hospital. So it's causing, as you have pointed out, it's backing the system up. But there isn't a patient flow through the system that's working for people at the moment.
And I don't think it just starts from there. It starts right from the minute they get into that ambulance. The ambulance could be stood in front of ER for 12 hours, and the paramedics would be sat in the ambulance with the patient. I've actually heard colleagues tell me that they finish their shift and come back the next morning after being home, and the same patient is in the back of the ambulance because they've not been able to get them into a hospital corridor. It's that bad. So it really starts at that point. So there's, yeah, you're right, the turnover is awful. There's absolutely, social care, health care. I mean, these are sisters. They have to work hand in hand. If someone is fit for discharge, where does this person go? And I find this other thing quite amusing as well. Have you heard about these virtual wards that they talk about? Oh, yeah. Do you want to tell them a bit about these virtual wards?
So there's been lots of kind of pledges from the government about what's going to improve things, because we don't have enough capacity in our hospitals at the moment, and the social care is under a lot of pressure as well. And so these virtual wards are not a new thing. There was this idea that you could have care at home, and that somebody would be keeping an eye on you through various different devices. But you need staff to be able to do that, and it's tricky, it's complicated, it needs a lot of training for people. And the idea that a virtual ward is going to fix the situation at the moment is just it's just not going to work, is it?
It's not going to work, and it's quite interesting, you know. So replace the GP with the GP assistant, replace the surgeon with the surgeon assistant, surgical assistant, replace the nurse with the nurse assistant, replace them all, because we don't want to give our public quality care. Let's get an assistant in their place, because it's so much easier to do that. There is no focus on retaining the workforce. I mean, it's a bucket, and the bucket has many holes. You're pouring in water, but the water is leaking. You know, we really need to do something about these holes. And at the moment, if you were to take a nursing position or a junior doctor position, would you take it? I don't think so. I mean, we're really not setting a good example here, and it's so important that I simply can't believe how things have changed just in the past 10 years, isn't it? I mean, 10 years ago, the situation was so different. I mean, we took a lot of pride in, being a doctor and doing, for instance, I did general practice. I took pride in it. And I remember everyone I used to meet, I'd be like, forget about the hospital job, become a GP. I think, Sidra, you remember that, you know, when I used to meet random, junior doctors. I'd be like, no, you have to become a GP. It's fantastic. Just forget about hospital medicine. And I think I was one of the biggest GP recruits in Worcestershire. I was a Worcestershire trainee. And they'd be coming in, I'd be like, oh yeah, this is the best thing to do. And now when I look back, I'm like, not sure, because it's just so difficult. I mean, the retention is a huge problem. I know the Prime Minister suggested that he was so happy because apparently 500 new GP trainees have entered the system. It's the highest uptake so far. But does he really have faith that these GP trainees are going to finish training and stay in the United Kingdom? I'm not very sure about that, because once you've got the RCGP, you can work in Canada, you can work in Australia, New Zealand, and trust me, people are going to take off. These people are the cream of your society. These people are nurses, they're healthcare professionals, and they're just going to take off. They're not going to sit here to be abused, to be told they're not working hard enough. I mean, we're giving you 110%. There's not much more left of us.
Amazing, thank you so much. Great question. We'll go. Oh gosh, lots of questions. Okay, if you pass maybe just straight along, yes, and we'll go here, and then we'll go one more at the back, and then we'll call those four. If you could keep them brief, that would be absolutely fantastic.
I'll be quick. I'm just going to read from the new elective task force that the minister set up. I just don't understand it, so I was wondering whether you can break it down for me. It says ministers have set up a new task force, this is 7th of December 2022, to focus on how the NHS can better utilize independent sector to cut the backlog and boost overall elective activity. The Department of Healthcare and Social Care has announced. It sounds like privatization to me.
Yes, please.
Yeah.
So, I've been tweeting about this a lot because I'm horrified about it, actually. So in December, doctors like Anita and lots of other healthcare professionals were sort of ringing the alarm, basically. It's getting really bad, And there wasn't very much media focus at the time of how bad things were getting. In fact, what ended up happening at the end of December was that the journalists seemingly had a 2-week holiday. And on the 3rd of January, my phone was ringing off the hook because it was the Monday after New Year, and surprise, surprise, NHS crisis was all over the headlines. And it was like, this hasn't come out of nowhere, guys. This has been going on, you know. But anyway, at the beginning of December, as you say, Rishi Sunak and Steve Barclay, the Health Secretary, held a meeting in number 10 Downing Street with a number of people, and they called it the launch of this NHS Recovery Task Force. There was an organisation called Open Democracy that tried to find out at the time who was going to be attending this meeting, and the Downing Street didn't tell them. They said, sorry, you can't have that information. And so they submitted a Freedom of Information request, and they discovered that at this launch meeting, there was about half a dozen private healthcare CEOs in the room. There was maybe 20 people present, some of whom were kind of bosses of NHS trusts and stuff, but 6 or 7 private healthcare CEOs. And then they said that no minutes were taken at the meeting, so nobody knows what was actually discussed. But several weeks after that meeting, maybe it was about a month after, there was this announcement that £1 billion was going to be used to supply all these new ambulances and all these 5,000 new beds. And I went on to, I think it was Sky, on that day, and I saw the government press release that they'd sent out. There was nothing in the press release that said where this £1 billion was actually going to go, or who was going to work, who was going to be driving the ambulances, where were these
Because
beds?
they're striking, they're on picket
Nothing.
lines.
There was nothing about that in the press release. And my suspicion, although this hasn't been clarified yet, every doctor's going to be submitting our own Freedom of Information requests to find out. I suspect what's happened is that a lot of the money that is funding this recovery task force is being siphoned off into private healthcare companies, and that they will be using private ambulances or capacity in private hospitals in order to try and get rid of this backlog, the waiting lists. But as we were saying earlier, because the waiting lists are so long, and because we're already missing it's almost 10% of the entire NHS workforce in England, so we don't have enough staff even to staff the NHS. The idea that we're going to have this magical group of people who are going to swoop in and save everything, it's just not going to happen. What's actually going to happen, and I hear about this through our network, is that private companies are offering NHS staff slightly better terms and conditions to poach them across into the private healthcare sector. And some of the staff are doing it because they're desperate, they're having a terrible time. I don't blame any individual staff member for doing that, because I think they're under so much pressure and they're having a really difficult time. But systemically, it's not going to fix stuff. So I don't have high hopes for this elective task force, unfortunately. And I wish that they were being more transparent, because that's public money, right? Like, I think it's awful.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that explanation. Do you want to comment? Are you okay? Okay. Who was hands up nice? I think I had picked 4. Gosh, and now you've multiplied. Yes, we'll come straight to the front.
Hi. A slightly different one. And just background, I'm Austrian. I'm not British national. So for me, this is just shocking to see. I just always compare it in my head always to the transportation system here, which is also not public, and look at it now. But my question is actually, as someone who is healthy and doesn't see the GP a lot, you said before, if we are actually knowing what's going on, we should tell the MP.
Yeah.
But as someone who is healthy and is concerned about it and is, let's say, apolitical, like across the political spectrum, what can we do? Like, how can we get involved to raise awareness about the fact that it shouldn't be privatized, whether officially or unofficially. Like,
Yeah.
what can a normal, healthy person do?
Yeah,
to support?
well, it's a really good point, and it's kind of part of the reason I think that a lot of people haven't realised until very recently how bad things are, because the waiting lists weren't quite so long. Now, when I'm talking to people, just friends, family, whoever, there's always people saying, my dad can't get this and my mum can't get that, and what are we going to do? It's like in the public consciousness. But you're right, for people who are healthy, they're probably less aware of how bad things are. There's lots of campaigning organisations. I don't just want to talk about my own. There are loads of NHS groups who are doing really fantastic work. Do you want me to just name a few of them that you could look up? So one of them is Keep Our NHS Public, and they have Keep Our NHS Public. Yeah, they're anti-privatisation, and they have branches around the country. There's also a fantastic website with some information that's called Your NHS Needs You, and they have quite a lot of celebrities involved. And just to mention what we do, so I run an organisation called Every Doctor, and we are putting together, one of the things we're doing at the moment is making a map that shows a lot of layers of information about privatisation in the UK. So if you looked at everydoctor.org.uk, you could find some information about what I do. I'm sure there's some information, is there, on like the Trouble Club website about like our, following us and stuff.
Absolutely.
But it's all I
And
talk about all day long.
And we'll send out an email tomorrow after the event as well with all of the details.
But we have lots of kind of contact your MP tools. We run events. We talk all the time about this. And so if you wanted to know more, if you followed me on Twitter, then
everyone should follow both Dr. Anita and Dr. Julia on Twitter.
Absolutely. Yeah, so all of the work that we do is not we don't focus on one particular party, and when we're trying to create change, we do it across the board, and that's true of all the campaigning organisations, I think.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Dr. Anita. Do you want to anything?
No, that's fantastic.
Yeah, I do. And I think, who were my original two more? Wave at me and be honest. There we go. Thank you for being honest. If you will go yes and then over. And if you could make it quick, I mean, obviously, if you could make the question quick, but there aren't very many easy questions in this particular topic. Go for it, Nick. Yes, go for it.
You used to write articles for a newspaper about healthcare, but always very responsible ones, I promise you. And whenever I got a chance to interview a senior consultant or a professor, I'd always ask them how much medical research there was still left to do. How much did we know of the totality about human health so far? And they all said that we'd done between about 2.5% and 5% of the totality of the work. And a couple of the oncologists predicted to me that by about the year 2050, we should have had a breakthrough in our understanding of what's happening at the cell level. So we'll understand why cells go bad. So there'll be a sort of universal treatment for all cancers, which will be really easy, and we'll
Sounds
no longer
wonderful.
need some of the genetically targeted drugs, which at the moment cost maybe £50,000 or £100,000 per patient per year, and they have to take them for the rest of their lives. So I'm wondering whether you think in the future technology might give us a fantastic reduction in the cost of universal healthcare.
Lovely, quick question. One sentence or less?
I mean, I'm not. The thing is that, yes, I mean, technology is going to help us, but do you really want to live till you're 150 years old? I mean, do we really want to live that long? I'm not sure. I mean, I'd be happy. I'm South Asian. Our life expectancy is 67. I'd be lucky if I'd go till 70, and I'd be happily gone by 70. I mean, I think that what we've got to understand is that, yes, technology is going to be great, and there's going to be great breakthrough, but what science and history has taught us over the years is that we find the cure to one thing, and then we get stuck at another point. So it's very likely that we'll find the cure to this one issue, but we may encounter another one. It could be, I don't know, a natural calamity. It could be that, we're underwater. It could be anything. It could be it's a difficult one. But I certainly think that there's always going to be space. There's always going to be healthcare. The pandemic has taught us one thing. My dad used to say that only two businesses are the best to invest in. I think he had absolutely no clue how much doctors make. He used to think doctors are rich people. He had absolutely no idea. So he used to say two professions are very, very secure. One is if you have a restaurant, a diner or something, that's always going to work because people will always keep eating. They'd always want food. And the second is being a doctor.
I was going to say being a funeral director. I was like, they make all the money.
Yes. I think I need to get back to him on that one. There's a third one as well, Dad. But during the pandemic, we actually found out that the healthcare professional is always going to be in business. I know this sounds bad, but you're always going to need a doctor. So I think when it comes to your health, no matter what the breakthrough is within science, you'll always need a healthcare professional. And I don't think that a breakthrough in science is going to make you need the doctor less in any way. I think we'll always be needed, or I hope so.
Dr. Julia, do you want to comment on that at all?
I think AI will probably change things an awful lot, and I think that remains to be seen how. I mean, I don't think you can take humans out of healthcare because I think, the care is necessary, but it will be interesting. But I would just say on that as well, the NHS doesn't have a functioning IT system. So
Exactly.
the idea that we'll be fixing, I mean, literally, a lot of the computers don't turn on.
Loving Windows Vista still, yeah. Well, thank you so much. It's a great question. We could do an entire other event on the future of healthcare, but we'll have to say that for another time. Who was the final question? Yes, go for it. If we'll get you the microphone. If you can make it short, then that would be amazing. Go for it.
I'll do my best. Thank you for such a really engaging and exciting talk. I work for a health charity, and I wanted to hear your thoughts on the role of the third sector in this. Because I think one of the things that we do is we fund a lot of research, and I have a big question about we're funding research, but who's going to on improving health deliverables, but who's going to actually be able to deliver that? And I think linking to that question, technology is great. I'm also a futurist. Doesn't matter. Inequality is a massive issue, even if you're improving health for some, getting some people living to 150. What about the kind of mass? So we'd just love to hear your thoughts on the third sector and the role that we can play in actually improving things in the future.
You can take that.
Good question, yes. So I suppose what I know about the third sector, because I talk a lot about privatization and kind of systems, I'm concerned that a lot of NHS services have been outsourced into non-profits. So what's happened with the NHS, we talk a bit about privatization. That the idea that there are private companies in the NHS is alarming to a lot of people, and that seems to have caught on. People have understood that idea and they don't like it. But there's another aspect to what's happened to the NHS, which is the fragmentation of services, because in recent years, short-term contracts have been allowed all across England, and there's lots of charities who have taken on NHS contracts to deliver care. And what I hear from lots of patients is that that causes problems with long-term caring relationships. So particularly if you had a chronic healthcare condition and you'd got to know your team locally, if a contract changed hands because, let's say, a charity took it on for a while and then they stopped and then somebody else took it on, that can actually disrupt a lot of really important staff-patient relationships. And I think that's something that there hasn't been enough focus on. And I don't have any direct criticisms of any charity or any, non-profit health organisation that are trying to come in and do good work. I know there are fantastic people who work in the sector. It's just from my point of view, in terms of sustainability of a public healthcare system, I feel that it should all be publicly owned, publicly run, because otherwise there's a disruption in the caring relationships, and I've got huge problems about that. I don't know if you wanted to say anything, Anita, particularly on the research aspect of this. Did you want to know about that as well?
Because there's sort of delivery, there's advocacy, there's research. I think there's so many different avenues.
Can I just say one more thing?
Yeah.
On the advocacy thing, my biggest worry at the moment, because every doctor's a non-profit, but we're not a charity, because we took a lot of advice from people in the charity sector who said that there's limits to how much charities can speak up about some things that are deemed political, even if what they're really doing is just advocating for a group of people, often, as you say, who are often a marginalised group or a group who have health inequalities. And so we set ourselves up as a non-profit limited company, which people get very confused about, but it's to give us freedom in talking about things. My understanding from the charity sector is that there's lots of people who want to advocate for patients who are having a really bad time and are struggling to do that at the moment. Is that something that you've experienced?
Yes, I'm less in the policy space, but for sure,
Yeah.
I think that is...
That's my biggest worry, I think, with advocacy at the moment.
And I think when it comes to research and funding is another aspect of it, isn't it? Then I guess the matter of the fact is that you will need the private sector to also perhaps contribute and come in and take on that role. Because when it comes to, like my husband, he's a hepatologist at the QE, and there's a lot of work in terms of research that's being done in the QE, which is an NHS trust, not a very famous one because 5 doctors committed suicide in the past 5 years over there due to pressures. But my husband works there, and it's a good department, not the one where I'd lose him, I hope. I mean, he's all right. But you know, when it comes to hepatology research, you know, there are a lot of private companies that are gonna pay for it, and I think that is a good contribution towards the NHS in all fairness, because they're working on different medications, they're working, you know, there's a patient cohort trials and all sorts of things. So I guess when it comes to making a charity work, I mean, there's going to be lots of people who are going to like to sort of put in money because they can afford it, but I guess also private companies play a huge role, don't they?
They do with development of
development,
technology,
and
medicine,
research.
yeah.
Awesome. Okay, well, I think that's a really good point to end it on. Can we please give our speakers, Dr. Anita and Dr. Julia, a huge round of applause?